Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Complexity Lounge, a meetup where we gather to talk about all things related to complexity and complex adaptive systems. I'm Jocko Selberg, and I co-host the lounge together with Barbara Frontera and Tiani Jones. Today, we welcome Professor Chris Mowles to the Complexity Lounge. Chris has been director of the Doctor of Management program at Hertfordshire Business School in the UK for the last 15 years. The program works psychodynamically with insights from the complexity sciences, process sociology and philosophy, and group analytic theory to inform practice. As a consultant, Chris also works with managers to help address questions of organizational stability and change, evaluation and strategy, and focuses in particular on how teams work with uncertainty. Chris, welcome to the lounge.
Thanks very much for inviting me. So you invited me to talk for a bit, to give you some kind of ideas to chew on. And then we said we would have a discussion, which is great. So I'm delighted to be here to tell you about the research community at the University of Hertfordshire, which has been ongoing for more than 30 years now. So I'll give you a brief introduction to the history of the complexity and management group or department, or we've gone through many iterations at the university, but I think we're the complexity and management center now rather than group. To tell you a bit about how the ideas evolved over time, what they led to, and to prioritize the fact that actually the program itself and the research community in general arose and still arises from sets of relationships. So relationships are at the core, and I see in this, even in this group that's present today, other people who've been involved in that discussion. Chris Rogers, for example, have been involved in the discussion about the ideas around complexity at the University of Hertfordshire for a lot longer than me, and knew Ralph in the early days before the Doctor of Management program was even founded. I see Marcus and Augusto also here, who've been to the Complexity and Management Conference that we hold every year. So at the moment, there is something called the Doctor of Management program, which has been going for more than 25 years, and we've just had our 81st doctoral completion. Unfortunately, we're also going to close in the next 2 years because the university has decided that we don't make enough money. So I suppose I'm in reflective mood at the moment, thinking about, you don't often get a chance to write a living obituary. So I'm in a reflective mood, thinking about the history of our traditions and how we got where we got. And in order to demonstrate that, I'm going to share my screen. I'm hoping that you can see that. Yep. Can you see what I see, which is Complexity Lounge, September 2025? Great.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Ralph Stacy, I've written a chapter, which I haven't listed on the list of resources, but can do. I've written a chapter on Ralph's development as an academic. But Ralph started out as an economic modeler. And it was when he was modeling the economy of Lesotho that he came across mathematical complexity, became very intrigued, left his life in business and decided to become an academic, where he worked developing his ideas on complexity during the 1990s, writing 3 or 4 books in which this model was developed. So you can see, broadly speaking, it's a very sophisticated version of a Cartesian 2x2 diagram, beloved of business schools, where complexity applies and where it doesn't apply. And wherever you type Stacy into your search engine, this will come up in a whole variety of different forms. And there are even videos about the Stacy diagram. So it's ubiquitous on the internet. And the interesting thing was that when Ralph was developing his ideas about complexity and trying to think about them in organizational terms, he attracted to his PhD group at the University of Hertfordshire two key members of what were to become faculty members of the Doctor of Management program, Patricia Shaw and Doug Griffin, who engaged with him in fierce conversation about some of these ideas around complexity, and became his PhD students and graduated and persuaded Ralph, although he was very much against it, to form a doctoral program. And in the UK, I think you have these in the US as well, started a professional doctorate where people were invited to take what's going on for them at work as their subject and object of study for their PhD. But in the development of the program came the development of the ideas. And in fierce discussion between the three of them and a broader group of academics and people who were interested in the ideas, Ralph dropped this Stacy diagram at the end of the 1990s as being insufficient for explaining how he wanted to take complexity forward. This was partly to do with Doug's background as a philosopher and the ideas that he brought with him, particularly with pragmatist philosophy, partly to do with Patricia's engagement, partly to do with the fact that Ralph was also training as a group analyst at the Institute of Group Analysis and came across the ideas of Norbert Elias. But the two key reasons that he dropped this Stacy diagram is it's essentially constructivist. So you can take up a position outside complexity that you're considering and choose which sector of this diagram you find yourself in. And it follows an if-then causality. If you're in this sector, then these conditions apply. If you're in a different sector, then some other conditions apply. Ralph, Patricia, and Doug wanted to develop an idea of complexity that you couldn't stand outside of in keeping with pragmatic philosophy. So there's, if you like, both Norbert Elias, the process sociologist who's included in the thinking, and pragmatic philosophy takes the view that there's no standing outside society. There's no God's eye view in Dewey's terms. I think the other thing that Doug and Ralph noticed is the moment that they showed this diagram on the screen, everybody in the audience relaxed. It's almost as if they could become passive in the face of this diagram. So it kind of released tension from struggle of coming to terms with complexity. So instead of thinking about 2x2s, Ralph, Patricia, and Doug engaged with the manifestation of the complexity sciences, which they found most amenable for thinking about what's going on in society in general and organizations in particular, complex adaptive systems models. So there are many other varieties of complexity models in the complexity sciences. You've had Jean Bolton on your Complexity Lounge as a speaker, and she is an devotee of Prigogine and his dynamical systems. For the complexity group at the University of Hertfordshire, it was complex adaptive systems models, not as they are taken up in the flocking model. You can see why the flocking model was of great interest to organizational scholars and sociologists, because it presents a completely different understanding of stability and change. So stability and change arises simply and only because of what all the different agents in the Boyd simulation, they were called Boyds, and they were following three simple instructions. Head towards the center of your neighboring Boyds, keep at constant speed, keep equidistant from your neighboring Boyds. So the pattern of predictable unpredictability of flocking arises simply and only because of those simple instructions. So very arresting in some ways, because it's a bottom-up theory of change, but also limited in the sense that all the Boyds are the same and they're all doing the same thing. It also has the tendencies to suggest that somehow there is a programmer outside the simulation giving instructions to the Boyds, which of course is very appealing to the discipline of management, which assumes, or consultancy, which assumes the same relationship. So in the complexity group, they were turned to the evolutionary complex adaptive systems as a model for thinking about evolutionary change in society, where there are different categories of agents who are programmed to do different things. And then, even with deterministic instructions, novel behaviors, novel agents emerge in the evolutionary complex adaptive system. So at the University of Hertfordshire, we identified 5 characteristics of these evolutionary complex adaptive systems of interest, and then took them up by analogy in social terms. So if you like, it goes beyond the computer-based model. So first of all, the first characteristic is the idea of non-linearity of the model. So just like a meteorological model, evolutionary complex adaptive systems iterate and then reiterate to produce qualitative patterns over time. So the model is in constant motion, no stable state. The second characteristic of interest is the idea of emergence, that in a non-linear system with interacting agents, novel patterns emerge which could not have been predicted by the programmer. The third characteristic of interest is the fact that these models are multi-agent and there's no one locus of control. There's no center, no controlling agent or group of agents which dictates the activity of all the other agents. The same is true of the human brain. So the human brain comprises 14 billion neurons, which fire through synapses linking neurons to their local neighborhood of neurons. And what the synapses do is provoke the firing or inhibit the firing of neighboring neurons to produce the activity that we think of as consciousness and self-consciousness. The fourth characteristic of interest is order and change arises simply and only because of the activity of agents acting with their local population of agents. If you take the model of the human brain, synapses are negotiating constraints. And you might think of that being true also in the Boyd simulation, that all the Boyds are reflexively negotiating their relationship with each other. In a moment, I'm going to think about what that might mean in social terms. But in this context, they are said to be self-organizing. I think self-organizing is a term which is a bit problematic in the organizational context, because people sometimes understand self-organization to mean allowing people to do what they want. And that's not what it means in a complex adaptive system. The last characteristic of interest in this complex adaptive systems model is the idea of paradox. So the global pattern of flocking, or whatever it is that the model is doing, arises simply and only because of what all the agents are doing in their activity, reflexively self-organizing. But at the same time, that reflexive self-organization is constrained by the global pattern. So the idea of a paradox is at the heart of a complex adaptive systems model. And again, I'm going to take that up in a moment and think about what that might mean in social terms. Now, I beg your forgiveness for this because it's a very simplistic comparison. So down the central column, you'll see that I have something called orthodox management. There is no such thing as orthodox management. I hope you don't think I'm creating a straw man just to knock it down, but just for the purposes of argument, I would guess that in most organizations, in an everyday way, some of these assumptions are pretty standard. So I'm guessing they will be recognizable. So let's take the first characteristic that I identified of the complex adaptive systems model, the idea that there is no equilibrium state. It's simply qualitative pattern changing over time. In orthodox management, the idea is that in order to change an organization, you have to put it through some kind of change process. So the idea is then some kind of diagnosis is done. And orthodox management theory often borrows from the natural sciences, usually engineering or medicine. So we either have to re-engineer the organization or we have to restore it to some kind of healthy state. It's deemed to be unhealthy and unfit for its environment. So then you organize a change process, the Lewin idea that you have to somehow unfreeze, change, and then refreeze. So there's a stable state at either ends of the change process. And what you try and do is intervene in the organization from a position both outside it and inside it. So outside it because you can diagnose, but you're inside it because you're part of the change process at the same time. And it usually involves some kind of idealized end state, realized through a vision of some kind. By comparison, if you were to take the complexity sciences seriously, by analogy, you would say that organizations are always in a dynamic state. And even if they look relatively stable, it's because everybody's working incredibly hard to keep it so. So organizations are never at rest. This quotation of history being one damn thing after another is variously attributed to Churchill and various other great people in history. So what's going on is constant activity, constant improvisation, never stable. Let's take the idea of emergence then, which arises in nonlinear systems because of the exploration of difference and variation. In orthodox management terms, we are invited to align. I get so sick of this word alignment. All my students use it. They're all professionals of one sort or another doing jobs. And they're always talking about alignment. So there is assumption that if we all line up and point in the same direction, we will get what we want. And that leaders and managers can predict the ways in which we need to align and point in the same direction. Whereas from a complexity perspective, you would argue that nothing novel would ever arise if we all pointed in the same direction and agreed about everything. That actually novelty emerges through the exploration of difference. Now, this isn't an argument I'm making that organizations don't need to cohere. Of course they need to cohere. But that's not the same as arguing that people need to align. We even need to align our values, apparently, in organizations these days. Let's take the third characteristic in these complex adaptive systems model. There is no one center of control. There's no center of the human brain controlling brain activity. Same is true of ant colonies and bee colonies, of course. In orthodox management, there is a hugely inflated discourse on leadership, and it permeates politics more broadly. And it's almost as if every social problem that we have, every organizational problem can be resolved through leadership. If you took a complexity experience, you would begin to think that even the most powerful in society themselves have no ability to predict and control for everybody else. And at the beginning of this discussion, before we kicked off, Barbara was telling me about a CEO that she had who wanted to set everybody's strategic objectives before doing their work. So once you have those models, which are very leader dependent, you can guarantee that things are going to go badly wrong in an organization. So even leaders are caught up in webs of interdependence with other powerful figures and don't have nearly as much cachet and ability to control as we give them credit for. One might ask, and perhaps that's a separate discussion that we might have alongside this, about why there's so much discourse in universities and business schools and consultancies on leaders and leadership. It's certainly the case that a small group of top leaders have done very well from this discourse. Let's take the fourth characteristic, reflexive self-organization. So we place constraints on each other and improvise and negotiate together to get the job done. Okay, Jocko, I'll talk to you when I finish this point. Yeah. So in orthodox management, there's a focus on the big picture, on the direction that we're taking, on the strategy, on abstract policies that are taken at the top table. And these are, of course, important because they inform activity and identity in organizations. But if you were to take a complexity perspective, you would also be interested in how those abstractions of plans, strategies, and policies play out in practice. Of course, we have aspirations to change the organization or to focus the organization, but what actually happens when these plans, which are generalizations and abstractions, are taken up between people in their everyday work? Jocko, what did you want to say?
Nothing. My mouse misclicked it. So
Okay. Fair enough.
However, while we're interrupting you, there's a back and forth going on in the chat about the word intention as used in this. Could you let me just see if I can summarize what they're saying here. Unless Greg, you'd like to unmute and talk about this a bit.
No, I think I want to listen to what Chris has to say about this.
All right, I wasn't sure.
But I think it's fair to say that the idea of intention is very orthodoxly taken to imply something that only humans possess. So it's not surprising that this gets challenged when we're talking about intentions in regard to complex adaptive systems. But I think the question actually arose from the idea that intention implies the intention of a designer standing outside of the system. And what Chris is talking about is diverse intentions within a complex adaptive system. that no one person can get a view from nowhere to pick up. So I don't think it's complex, but
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, I just
yeah,
was like, there was a lot of back and forth, and I was wondering if there was any problem with the word intention. But
I think
you've answered that.
there is a good question about whether we have intentions or whether intentions have us. So do we identify with some kind of social trend that's happening that calls out something in us? Paradox. So the paradox of forming and being formed. So in orthodox management, there is a separation into dualisms. We have the idea that we have to think first and act second. Actually, in practice, it's probably the other way around. We act and find ourselves acting and think about that activity. But nonetheless, there's a separation, thinking and action, means from ends, task from process. And if we're to reintroduce paradox then into the question, as the pragmatists do, that there is no task without process. The way that you undertake your task, the means that you use to undertake your task will affect the outcome. There's no separating I and we. There's no separating success and failure. Happy to go into these in more depth as we go through. I'm pretty confident that Ralph Stacey never read Edgar Morin, but I think what we've done at the University of Hertfordshire is pretty well fulfilled what Edgar Morin called for. So he made a distinction between restricted and generalized complexity, and some people still keep to that distinction, that they still build complexity models, they still use data, they still stick very much within the paradigm of the natural sciences. Whereas Morin argued for a trans or interdisciplinary approach to the complexity in order to realize its full power in terms of the effect on its thinking. And I think that's exactly what we've done at the University of Hertfordshire in the complexity sciences. So by drawing on these insights from the complexity sciences and arguing by analogy and turning to the social sciences, particularly but not exclusively the process sociology of Norbert Elias, pragmatic philosophy, particularly John Dewey and George Herbert Mead and Charles Sanders Peirce, and group analytic psychotherapy. And the last three of these are more or less informed by the tradition of Aristotle, Hegel, Darwin, and Freud, to take a human and dialectical understanding of complexity between human beings. So if you like, and to an extent, we're leaving the computer-based models behind and to accept as a source domain for thinking about analogies, and turning instead to the social sciences to put some clothes on these ideas. And in my last book, apologies for pushing my last book, but I think what we do is apply complexity thinking to some key sociological questions, such as the structure agency question. We've developed a theory of action, a theory of mind, a theory of communication, a theory of time, a theory of ethics, and a theory of authority. And it's complexity all the way down. So some people who adopt a complexity position argue that it applies in some circumstances and not others. I don't know whether anybody's a Terry Pratchett fan, or if you've even heard of Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett was a science fiction writer who drew, I think this is the cover of one of his books, but it's probably an apocryphal story that the philosopher Bertrand Russell was interrupted when he was giving a talk in London in the 1930s by a woman who was had a mystical training, and she said that everything Bertrand Russell had said was wrong, and really the world was a flat disk. This is Terry Pratchett's disk world. The world was a flat disk which balanced on the back of 4 elephants. And Bertrand Russell said, but what's below the 4 elephants? Where she said, well, they stand on a turtle. Well, what's below the turtle? Well, after that, it's turtles all the way down. So our approach to complexity is complex all the way down. There's no way to stand outside complexity and take a view on it in a constructivist position of choosing. This situation is simple. This situation is complicated. This situation is chaotic. For us, and for every aspect of human relating, it's complex all the way down. So what would a critique be of the position that we take? I argued in my blurb for this talk that actually I think we take a radical position. I think that radical position is to take an interdisciplinary approach to combine complexity sciences with social theory, to take a radical position assuming that there's nowhere to stand outside society and take a view on it, and to take an interest in the everyday, practical, interdependent, reflexive negotiation of what happens in organizational life. If you like, we turn the telescope the other way around. Instead of looking at the big picture and instead of looking at parts and whole, we're looking instead at the patterns that arise between people as they negotiate how to go on together. So what would be a critique of the position that we adopt at the University of Hertfordshire? That we're a bit hard on orthodox management theory. So anybody who read my middle column on my table a few slides back, if you might feel aggrieved that I've not done orthodox management justice. The second critique is that we offer no practical tools or techniques. So when I talk to groups of managers, there's always a smaller group within the group I'm addressing that says, well, so what? These ideas are all very interesting, but so what should we do about it? Where's the tool and technique? Where's the 5-step model? What would you recommend we do? We privilege microprocesses, which is not to say that we're uninterested in larger patterns, larger abstractions about what's going on in organization or what's going on in society. But our key attention is on the here and now between us in this context, trying to get something done. So what's with these revisable, tentative, specific, context-laden analyses that we're doing? How helpful are those? And aren't we being quietist? Shouldn't we take a more radical and emancipatory position? So probably the principal difference between my research community and a more overtly critical management group is that we would say that what's going on is pretty terrible and we might have an idea about what would replace it. So we pursue these ideas with very light touch emancipatory intent. So the second part of my talk really is to think about what these ideas might mean in practice, particularly because we live in dark times. So our key sociologist, Norbert Elias, came up with a description of complexity theory before there was even complexity theory. So in his 1939 PhD thesis, he argues that civilization, which is a term he's using without any judgment attached, but highly developed societies, if you like, emerge simply and only because of the interweaving of everybody's intentions, of which no person or no group is in control. And that's pretty similar to exactly the same description of order and disorder that I was using when I was describing the complex adaptive systems. So Norbert Elias is a process sociologist to whom we turn a lot in our body of ideas, but he also had the idea that there's nothing inevitable about progress. Actually, the civilizing process can go into reverse. And I think probably that's something that's we're encountering in the early 21st century in the world at the moment. You look around at what's going on and you wonder how it is that we can be so advanced technologically and so lacking in progress in terms of our relationships with each other as we continue to appoint demagogues and stupid people to lead us. So, and I suppose in this quotation, so the companion volume to Norbert Elias's great work called The Civilizing Process was a counter volume, if you like, as a German Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany. He wrote a book called The Germans, where he tried to understand how a nation can descend into barbarism. So, if you like, what he argues is that civilization, whatever we think that means, is a fragile project and can sometimes go into reverse. And it arises from a unique combination of relatively stable self-discipline, which are expressed in relatively stable institutions. If you like, our ability to regulate ourselves and each other are sedimented into institutions like the law and the press and stable government. So is it any surprise then that when we elect less stable individuals to lead us, the first thing that they do is to undermine the institutions that keep us relatively stable? So in this kind of context, where we seem to be going backwards socially, what does my group's understanding of complexity have to offer in this debate if we're not going to give tools and techniques and frameworks to help people plot a better future? Well, let's think about the future for a moment. And to cleave to some of the ideas that I've been outlining in our understanding of the complexity sciences, I would have to say that the future is unpredictable. We can't know the future. And as Virginia Woolf says, maybe that's a good thing. And maybe the future that we conceive from the here and now is an inadequate future given the scale of the problems that we have: environmental collapse, political degradation, authoritarianism, racism, barbarism. Maybe, and that's always been my problem with blue skies thinking, the idea of blue skies thinking, is that the blue sky that you can see, you can only see from where you're standing. And maybe the kinds of problems that we have these days require standing somewhere else or considering the same question continuously from a changing position. The last thing we need really is just to carry forward the current status quo. And certainly from a pragmatic perspective, they have very little interest in reaching the future with a plan. What Richard Rorty describes is a kind of fuzzy future, which emerges in our engagement with each other. So, as I said in the blurb at the beginning, I think the other radical aspect of what we stand for at the University of Hertfordshire is having a non-teleological theory of change. So we don't have to have a very concrete and precise understanding of the future that we're trying to achieve together. So what can we offer? So I think there are three things that we offer from our perspective. Probably a lot more than that, but I'll give you three for now. So I think the first thing is an orientation towards action to establish or re-establish relationships of solidarity with a medium of negotiating what's unique about who we are and what we have in common, but also what's different. So going back to my complexity model, emergence arises from the exploration of difference. Is take complex theory of time to account. So the complex theory of time is not new to us. I think anticipation of different futures. And three, the method for achieving this is sense-making, critique, and thinking. So let me deal with these three. Should I stop? Should I go on? There isn't much more, actually. How's the chat?
I don't see any specific questions. I think, well, if you would like to finish up, and then we'll just open it to a general discussion. Does that make sense, everybody?
Okay.
Thumbs
Yep.
up?
Okay.
Yeah?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Okay, I seem to have frozen on my computer for some reason. Okay, so re-establishing relationships of solidarity. So our method, I suppose, is about becoming visible to each other in public, in our uniqueness and our plurality. So these are ideas drawn from Hannah Arendt in particular, and her political philosophy, who stressed again and again the importance of coming together as a group, but also being able to explore our differences. And I'll link that straight back to the complexity model I explained at the beginning of the talk, which is the idea that novelty emerges in the exploration of difference. But it also enables us in group terms to enlarge our own point of view by exposing ourselves to the opinions of others. And it obliges us then to negotiate how to go on together in our differences. And this is a contingent and a provisional undertaking. We can make good enough agreements for now. Let's think about the importance of history. So there may be sparks of inspiration and hope in our past, which we need to rediscover and re-explore. Because the past is a resource to us. And in modern times, we find ourselves rushing endlessly to an idealized future and forgetting about the past as if it's something to be ashamed of. But we also have to realize that the past may not serve us well. So what we've done in the past may or may not be helpful for the kinds of problems that we're facing now, which are unique and different. But it involves exactly that exploration of the living present that St. Augustine pointed to. So between us in the here and now, we need to understand our history in anticipation of a future in the present moment. Thinking, sense-making, and critique. Well, the first thing to say about thinking is it doesn't necessarily achieve anything. We think for the point of thinking. And actually, as Hannah Arendt pointed out, actually sometimes it unravels things. in my own university, I get involved in discussions with bright, shiny people who think that the university, particularly the business school, is about educating people to make them good, productive citizens in corporations. Well, I'm still of the view, perhaps I'm old-fashioned in that sense, that I think education is for its own sake to produce active, critical thinking people. And I can't put a value on that in terms of job or salary. So thinking dissolves accepted rules of conduct. And that's why it's so dangerous. And thinking about who we are in our relationships with each other and what we experience together, John Dewey says that the forces that have influenced him the most, although he's extremely widely read in philosophy, are experience. So much as we are enchanted and bedazzled by AI, somehow we've forgotten about paying attention to the experience of being together and trying to work things out together as far as possible in the here and now, resonating bodies in a room, rather than turning to abstractions. So action, if we orientate ourselves towards action and understanding ourselves better in the social context in which we find ourselves, that actually allows us better to live a full life of our own. So one of the dangers of 21st century society is one of alienation. So we are increasingly individualized for a whole variety of reasons, and I think technology just accelerates that. So overcoming our individuality, our sense of being cut off from each other, is a way of more fully establishing our individuality. So one thing that Rahel Jaegi, a German sociologist, has in common with Norbert Elias is she argues that understanding our social connectedness is the quickest route to understanding our individuality, which is exactly the same point that Norbert Elias made. So understanding our position in the social network, understanding better the groups that we're part of and the groups that we've left, is a description of how individuality arises. It's not a denial of individuality. Critique, I think, is really important because you have to be able to establish the limitations of your own position and puncture what Norbert Elias refers to as a heroic we identity. One of the ways of understanding current political struggles is it seems to be a war of heroic we identities. Make America great again. We even have politicians in the UK saying that we should make Britain great again, and that somehow the white nation is more heroic than any other nation, or the British nation is more heroic. So in order to puncture the totalitarianism of heroic we identities and our own sense of ideology, so we're all ideological to a greater or lesser extent, we think the world is the way we see it. So to stay connected obliges us really to enter into critique and to explore the limitations of our own position. So bringing people together, negotiating past, present, and future, exploring our plurality, thinking about our uniqueness and our solidarity, creates the possibility of hope. is a quote from Rebecca Solnit that I quite like. In these moments of rupture, people find themselves members of a we that did not until then exist, at least not as an entity with agency and identity and potency. New possibilities suddenly emerge, or that old dream of a just society re-emerges and, at least for a little while, shines. So going back to the barbarism of Norbert Elias, the dream of a just society, and certainly realizing it, is fragile and fleeting. I came across Svetan Todorov relatively recently. He's a Bulgarian emigre to France and a historian. And he wrote a history of Bulgaria during the Second World War, because Bulgaria is unique amongst many of the countries that was dominated by the Nazis, because they saved a very high proportion of their Jewish population. And it's a very interesting book in the sense that it's not very discursive. There's only 1 or 2 chapters of discursive narrative. Most of it is chapters of episodes of what was taking place in different parts of society to make this achievement. And it seems to me a very good presentation of the way that I'm understanding complexity, which is partial, negotiated, in the here and now, in the experience of negotiating with concrete others. So Todorov says, looking back and reflecting on the rescue of the Bulgarian Jews, one comes to realize that no one individual or single factor could have brought this about. The community were opposed to the anti-Semitic measures, but a community is powerless without leaders, without those individuals within its midst who exercise public responsibility, in this case, the metropolitans, the deputies, the politicians. He also has chapters about trade unionists who are doing exactly the same thing, who are ready to accept the risk their actions entailed. All of this was necessary for good to triumph in a certain place, at a certain time. Any break in the chain and their efforts might have failed. It seems that once introduced into public life, evil easily perpetuates itself, whereas good is always difficult, rare, and fragile, and yet possible. So this multiple perspectival, moment by moment, community-based, concrete, particular resistance to the Nazis achieved a result for the Jewish community in Bulgaria that many other countries didn't achieve. But he sees it as a complex and a fragile achievement. And the parallels for me, I mean, obviously, there's much less at risk in organizations, but there's, I think strategy is an achievement, and negotiated achievement in organizations that's realized in concrete, local, contextual ways. And to finish, William Blake, he who would do good to one another must do it in the minute particulars. General good is the plea of the scoundrel, hypocrite, and flatterer, for art and science cannot exist but in minutely organized particulars. And I suppose that's what I've been recommending to you. Not grids, not frameworks, not an idealized view of the future, but methods for engaging with each other in the here and now in very practical ways to exercise agency in the discovery of our plurality. I'll stop.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. Okay. We have the most recent thing I've seen in the chat is from Chris Quinn. Chris, do you want to ask your question about dissolves accepted rules of conduct, or shall I just go forth?
That would be appreciated. Thank you. I don't
Okay.
need much on it. There's
Yeah.
some other great questions in there. It was a few pages back, Chris. Apologies.
Yeah.
It was a quote that ended with, I think it was to do with the act of thinking, and that in itself, in certain contexts, can dissolve something. Accepted rules of conduct. Sorry, I wondered if you could elaborate lightly on that. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, thinking doesn't dissolve anything, but if we were to think together, then it becomes possible to challenge the way that we always behave or what we take for granted. I think that's what Hannah Arendt is getting at.
Thank you. That's what I was hoping it was getting at. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. One of the things she argued for is to be able to think without banisters. And what she meant by that is normally we take the guardrails of what is acceptable and isn't acceptable to think about or to do. And she was saying, well, actually, if we can think together on a regular basis and get good at it, then we begin to challenge what's taken for granted. I mean, let's think about the Overton window and how it's moved just recently in the last 10 years about it's acceptable and not acceptable to say about Muslims, for example, or about immigrant communities. That window has really shifted in the last 10 years, where people are saying completely unacceptable things. Politicians, people of repute, people who should know better, are saying completely unacceptable things on television that even 10 years ago would be impossible to say. So somehow, if we don't get together to think and to be critical and to call it out, that Overton window shifts further and further towards totalitarianism. So we have to call things into question, I think, is what Hannah Arendt is saying.
Okay. Ian, you had some observations and some questions. Would you like to unmute and engage with Chris? You're still muted. There you go.
Yes, I am still here, so I am rushing. I did in fact put a question in advance, and in fact I can guess the answer to the question now. I've listened to the whole presentation, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So, as well as what you've described as a radical interpretation of complexity sciences, I'm trying to find some agreement, again using the language in the introduction, that our aspirations evolve and change in our interactions with each other and the world. That sort of statement is more than science, even if it's explicable on good scientific basis. The stuff that we're talking about now is more than science, and you used literary examples and all sorts of things all the way through there. So I'm hoping it's a relatively simple answer to my question, that what we're talking about is more than science.
Yeah, I suppose there are two ways to answer that. One is to go Edgar Morin's way and to say, well, we need more than science, particularly natural science as it's understood in its restricted terms. But I think, if you like, the complexity sciences are a minority discipline in the natural sciences, and they say some extraordinary things about the world, as does quantum physics, for example. And Jean Bolton would be a better guide to quantum physics than me, because she's a theoretical physicist by training. But, you know, particles can be entangled even at great distance. They can be waves and particles. So there are minority disciplines within the natural sciences which still say some unimaginable things about the natural world. And most orthodox management theory draws on the natural sciences in the restricted sense, particularly in terms of borrowing from analogies from biology, parts and whole thinking, that kind of stuff. But what I'm trying to do is to claim that even within the natural sciences, there are extraordinary, unexplainable, explainable things, but things that we still find our heads difficult to get round in terms of what goes on between human beings.
Yeah, in a way, that's why my question, I sort of put the explicability part of it, but the predictable unpredictability, I think, was the language used. So we can explain how and why things work the way they do, but we can't use science to then make the predictions, make the repeatable experiments, things like that. So it stops being science when you use it, even though you can explain it by science. Yeah.
Well, I suppose you could say that there are some scientific disciplines which have limited predictability anyway. So let's take
Oh, yeah.
meteorological models. They're probabilistic models, aren't they? And
Yeah,
they
well, I'm
are,
not just thinking of probabilistic, but yes, okay. Yeah.
yeah. So they're less and less accurate the further you go into the future. So prediction is of limited value in a meteorological model.
Yes. I guess that's why I kept it a simple question to start with. So there's an awful lot of so what quest details that follow from it. But
yeah,
if you're quoting Arendt and Todorov and Terry Pratchett and William Blake, we're talking, they're also my sources as well. Just getting into the conversation that things at this level of complexity are not just not predictable with say levels of certainty, but with completely unknown levels of certainty. It's not like predictable with certain confidence intervals. It's just unpredictable with any certainty.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The future is radically uncertain.
I guess it's just a bee in my bonnet when I hear people constantly referring to everything as so-and-so science, so-and-so science, so-and-so science. I think it just kind of, in the receiver's minds, people think it's all about science, and I think there's a massive amount of it that's not.
Yes, agreed. But I think when I talk about this stuff, people demand a kind of grounding in science without realizing how groundless some of their scientific claims are about what happens between human beings.
Yeah.
So in a minority and critical position, I find myself having to work harder than the mainstream management theorists have to justify what they're saying.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's much appreciated.
Okay. I'm trying to coalesce some of the things in the chat into a question, but while I'm doing that, why don't somebody raise their hand and ask a question? Although I could ask one as well, Chris, while I'm here. You talked a little bit about history. And well, I think that part of the problem we're facing now is this, you talk about how everyone's very optimistic about the future, but there's also this sort of weird nostalgic rewriting of the historical record as well. And I think that is an increasing problem as well for many of us that are trying to deal with this.
Yep. What's that African proverb? Until lions have their historians, tales of hunting will always glorify the hunter. Yeah, so there's an ideological going on, isn't there, where a particular understanding of history is selectively chosen in order to promote a heroic we identity, in Elias's terms. So the kind of history that the MAGA movement aspires to, and apologies if anybody is a MAGA supporter, seems to me to be white-dominated, male-dominated, xenophobic, and describes a world that never existed, or it existed in some ways. Certainly American society was white-dominated and misogynistic, no doubt about it. But nonetheless, even then there were cracks and fissures and resistance and variety that doesn't get incorporated into the dominant narrative. So America has always been a migrant society, an immigrant society. And you wouldn't be the nation that you are without that immigration. But somehow that's covered over in the dominant narrative. So exploring our histories and making them more plural is also an ideological project, or it's a project of resistance, I think.
Thanks for that. Yeah, it's obviously it's a problem on every level, because organizations do it as well. They sort of rewrite their history to make the present state more palatable.
Yes.
in many instances. Yeah. Okay, no hands up yet. But hold on a second. I saw something in here that
Barbara can ask
Yeah,
in the meantime.
you have your hand up.
yeah, Gianni, go ahead.
I wanted to know a little bit more on you had the 3 points of, the first one was this reestablishing relationships of solidarity.
Yeah.
And there were several factors there. One of them was about enlarging our point of view by engaging with others' opinions, different ideas, because then our mind gets expanded. We can question assumptions that we have and all those kinds of things. But could you talk a little bit more about that? And the reason why I had a question is because the idea of having solidarity, for me, it seems to be almost like a principle that would have to be shared to even want to do that, versus a competitive or some other like base mode of interaction. And so, yeah, I'd just like to know a little bit more about your thoughts on that one and some things behind it. Yeah.
The same author who wrote about alienation, Rahel Yegi, also writes about solidarity. And I think there's a quality of solidarity which has the paradox of similarity and difference. So the similarity is you recognize that another community is going through similar struggles to yours, but they are also a different community. So it has exactly what I'd be looking for. It's both plural, it's dividing and unifying at the same time. So one of our unique abilities as human beings is to experience empathy. I know that Elon Musk thinks that's a huge woke 20th century mind virus and a bug in the system and a weakness. But as far as I like the term hardwired, I don't like the term hardwired. I think we are hardwired for empathy. We have mirror neurons, for example. So we can have an insight into somebody else's experience simply by seeing something happen to them, which is why we like movies. So the ability to develop our sense of solidarity with others is just rediscovering what makes us uniquely human. Not just us. I mean, mammals also, some mammals also have that same ability. Can have and I think to a degree it involves being able to take oneself as an object to oneself. So bonobos, chimpanzees, dolphins, elephants all have the ability to take themselves as an object to themselves, and also then to see other elephants or chimpanzees as like them but not like them at the same time. It's that paradox of similarity and difference. So some other mammals can also express solidarity, as well as aggression and rivalry and all the things that we can too.
Thank you.
So there's a bit in the chat too that I find an interesting thread to pull up on this question of hindsight.
Yep.
You know, and if you could talk to that a little bit in how this hindsight question plays into your approach to complexity.
Do you mean re-exploration of the past?
Sure, and I mean, Greg uses the quote here, what we will have been doing, you know, in terms of hindsight, right? Okay. Yeah, you understand? Yeah.
So is this the idea of sort of forecasting, imagining oneself into a future state and then looking back on what we would have been doing had we got to that state?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a view of that, to be honest. Perhaps Greg can explain it.
He's had to go, unfortunately. It was, I was trying to get my head around it myself, and so I thought, well, I'll just throw that at Chris and see what happens.
Well, I suppose, I mean, Shell developed that, didn't they, in the form of scenario, different strategy through scenario planning. So you imagine different scenarios, and that involves imagining yourself into the future. But as we've discovered, there's a limit to being able to do that, because you can only imagine a future from where you're standing now with all its limitations.
Okay, Dave has his hand up. Dave, go right ahead.
Yeah, I'll ask a question kind of related. You mentioned about paradoxes, and the paradox of it's an uncertain world. We don't know what's going to happen. And yet we're often working in systems that want certainty, want a plan that's going to be fulfilled in a certain time frame. And so you kind of create this tension between the two. And often the really good leaders know it's uncertain, but they also know the C-suite wants certainty, and they almost have to follow the uncertain path while pretending to be certain.
Yeah.
If that makes sense, but it's sort of this dichotomy.
Yeah, it's an interesting performance in a way, because everybody knows that you can't deliver a predictable future. So, and yet we still engage with this. It is a very interesting phenomenon. We all know that we're pretending, and yet we continue to pretend.
Yeah, we're on our 14th replan.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so there's 2 questions in the chat. Dave, were you done?
Well, I was just quick add. Hindsight
Okay.
is also really good at giving us a false assumption about what really happened.
Yeah. There's a lot of self-justification in hindsight sometimes, isn't there?
Yeah.
Okay, Chris Quinn, are you still here? Would you like to ask your question yourself, or shall I just go for it?
Go for it. Thank you.
Okay. Chris asks one of the other Chris's asks, what prevents complexity science becoming mainstream? I can count on one hand the number of clients and fellow consultants who have heard of it, and even less than that who have entertained the idea of working with it.
In some senses, it is mainstream, in the sense that for at least 50% of people, they recognize immediately what you're talking about when you say that life is complex. So ask anybody if what they're doing now conformed to a plan that they followed in a linear fashion from when they were children. Almost nobody in the room knows what you're talking about. Sorry, almost nobody in the room will say, I've had a plan and I've fulfilled it in a linear way. So they get absolutely this description of social life as being predictably unpredictable and unpredictably predictable, stable and unstable both at the same time. But if you take a radical position and say, well, actually, if the future is radically uncertain, there's no tool or technique for achieving the kind of complexity that you want. Management is an instrumental discipline. It wants things to do, steps to follow, grids and frameworks to apply, to simplify it. So I think it's both present and not present in organizations, and it depends whether you think there is something to be done. So if you're a complexity modeler, you might build a model of a particular industry to model how the different players in that industry are working together. If you wanted a tool or a framework, there's a very famous one by a gentleman who I think attends this group or has attended this group in the past, who has all kinds of methods and tools and frameworks which you can pay for and apply to the complexity in your situation. And so that, there are different schools of thought who think that complexity is reducible to some kind of instrumental method. Is that not your experience? People are selling, you go on LinkedIn, everybody's a complexity theorist these days, and they sell all kinds of methods. There are as many methods as there are complexity theorists, I think. So many thought leaders.
And let's not forget the futurists.
Yeah. Yeah, forecasting was quite popular a few years back, the idea that you can predict the future, and some people were selling themselves as having that unique ability to see into the future. That seemed to go out of fashion again. Does that answer your question, Chris? I mean, how do you want to take up complexity in your work?
I think the world that I'm from, there's a lot of money still being made from the idea and the sales packs of making, quote, the complex simple.
Yeah.
And it's typically a more palatable sell for buyers. So while I agree with you, clients will, all of us will have had complex lives getting to where we are now, and that might be some kind of notional understanding of ourselves. But when it comes to work, maybe it's those banisters coming back up again. They need to,
Yep.
they act as though they have to have these planned linear outcomes. And so
Yep.
when I say things like, well, maybe actually we can't make the complex simple here, we just happen to be in a complex domain, it's not responded to well. I'm simplifying, but
Yep.
seems to be an outright rejection in my experience that
Yep.
Things can't be solved in a linear fashion, and yet
Yep.
they have a lot of history of trying to apply linear step-by-step approaches and achieving nothing more than incremental progress each time, and yet they still haven't quite grasped maybe there's another way. That's my frustration with it. So yeah.
Yeah, it is pretty frustrating. It is frustrating. I mean, it'd be hard. I mean, I had this discussion in another group the other day, and they were saying, well, would you do away with strategy altogether, for example? So if you can't predict the future. And how we used to laugh at the Soviet Union with their 5-year economic plans, right? And yet many organizations still do strategy. But I think it's worth thinking about the other reasons why they do strategy. So they'll do strategy in order to join the club. So my university renews its strategy every 5 years. And if they didn't, they would be the only university that didn't have a strategy, which is quite a brave thing to do. It's also a useful way of getting people to talk to each other if you're serious about it. I would guess that if you ask people in my university, even a week after the strategy has been announced, what the strategy is, very few people would know. But they would have memories of having joined some discussions with other people in the same organization about what we'll achieve in 5 years' time, even if they forget it as soon as they've walked out of the room. So it's about belonging. It's about showing yourself to be professional. It's about setting up meetings for people to talk to each other. It's about anxiety relieving. So I once did a consultancy with an organization where when I joined, the strategy had just run out, whatever that means. And some people were quite anxious about it. What should we do? Because we don't have a strategy anymore. And for other people, it wasn't anxiety provoking at all. They would simply do what they did yesterday with a bit of variation. And if there was some new situation, they might explore it with an authority figure to say, well, should we do this or should we do that? But strategy can be very anxiety provoking for people if they think that, you know, the old trope that if you don't know where you're heading, then you can't get there. And the idea of what I'm offering here as a non-teleological theory of change is quite disturbing for them. So
Yeah,
strategies have lots of uses, don't they, in organizations, but none of them, not very many of them are about strategy.
Comfort blankets. Yeah.
Yeah.
Important to give comfort blankets to the adults.
Sophisticated comfort blankets and identity support. We are a professional organization that has a strategy like all the other universities that has a strategy. We know what we're doing.
But it also is a response in many ways to the fear that uncertainty engenders, right? I mean, we are always trying to reduce it, whether we think we are or not. And if someone presents me with a beautifully designed hack that says, do this and all of your problems will be over, I might be tempted to bite.
Yeah.
Okay. Jean, I'm going to get to you in a second. I'm sorry, go ahead, Chris. Yeah.
I was just going to say, you know what the psychiatrist Wilfred Bion said about certainty in groups? So he argued that when groups become agitated, they stop paying attention to the task and they fall into unhelpful behaviors with each other. And they're quite likely to choose the most paranoid and mad person in the room to lead them. Because the most paranoid and mad person in the room is the one who's saying, I know how to do this. No. Follow me, and blame that group and you'll be fine. Follow me. Have you ever seen that? You probably have seen that video more than I have, though. The one of Trump saying there's nobody who knows more about tax than me. There's nobody who knows more about black people than me. There's nobody who knows more about buildings than me. There's nobody. So there you have the maddest person in the room claiming certainty. So when you have anxious groups in the United States looking for somebody to lead them, who would they choose? The most certain person and the maddest person. I bet I'm not offended anybody.
No, my anxiety's up. Jean, I'll get to you in just 1 second. Augusto had a question, a very direct question, and I'm going to read this aloud. And if I butcher it, please feel free to correct me, Augusto. Sure. I'm wondering about how those unbounded thinking spaces you mentioned around in organizational spaces management look like. There are, of course, power relations, narratives that are built also to somehow stabilize organizing at some level. Can these collective thinking spaces that you reference be part of an organizational structure, or do they sit outside of it, I think is the unasked part.
I think it's possible to start, they're never unbounded, of course, because they're bound by all kinds of other habits like politeness and turn-taking and what is and isn't acceptable to say in this organization. But gradually over time, I think it is possible to create and expand spaces where people can really explore what's going on. And Doug Griffin, one of the founders of the complexity program, used to say that the 3 most important questions any group can ask itself is, who are we? What do we think we're doing? And who are we becoming? So those 3 questions are pretty hard to answer in most organizations most of the time. But with practice and over time, and with a deliberate effort to expand those spaces where untrammeled conversation is possible, it is possible to have those sorts of conversations which challenge the status quo. Quite dangerous work sometimes, though. We value our staff and we take you very seriously and want to hear what you think, as long as you're telling us what we want to hear.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the whole formal versus informal structure thing. I think we get a debate about that with just about everybody on the call, one way or another, depending on the organization they came out of. But I will now pass it off to Jean. Is that correct, Jean?
It's Shin, so it's
Shin,
like the
Shin.
SH
Okay, yeah.
sound.
Shin. Okay.
Sorry, that's
no
it's
problem.
always
No.
causing trouble.
No, I really wish everybody would correct me on the pronunciation of their names. Thank you. Go ahead.
No worries, it's a Chinese name. So, but I live in Copenhagen, and I'm used to people having questions about my names. Chris, I see that you actually are a guest teacher or professor in Copenhagen Business School.
Yeah, I was there in August. Yeah.
Oh wow, yeah. I should keep an eye on it to maybe to go to one of your lectures. But anyway, so what I'm currently a bit okay, I think I have 2 parts to my question, or maybe it's 2 different questions. Let me start from my personal frustration in a way, and that is about, people like this group, which I would say like complexity aware people, or the complexity tribe, maybe people that can understand what you're saying, basically. But then if you imagine, if I show your deck to a normal I didn't say we're abnormal, but it's just but a manager, an executive, a developer, or a UX designer, not like Tierney, but a normal UX designer, they would think what this is all about. So I feel like I'm an architect. I call myself sort of a socio-technical architect. I feel like a strong sort of a passion to build a bridge between this language to a language that is more digestible to people I'm working with. And I say this out of love for them. I do not mean there is anything wrong, but I think it requires some kind of a intellectual interest in being able to dig this language. And so so that's one thing about the bridge building. So one thing, I realized that you also said a lot of things about, I use my own language, about having a conversation. And so I felt one of the things that helped me a lot is like Peter Bloch's theory about seeing leadership as a convening function, like convening conversations, naming the debate, and then asking these questions that are intrinsically paradoxical and ambiguous. For instance, what kind of a crossroad do you feel we're at? And in a strategy session could be, what is, asking people to break out into small groups and with a question like, what is my own contribution to what I'm complaining about? Something like this. There's no definitive answer, but you can have a conversation about it. I don't know. I just want to ask you, is that a way to build bridge that you see kind of could be helpful and in your view? So that's maybe the first question. And in terms of leadership, do you feel seeing leadership as a convening function to convene a nuanced conversation, would that be a helpful way to think about leadership? I think I'll start there.
Okay, so in terms of bridge building, so I say this a lot, so anybody's heard me give this talk will have probably heard me say this before. So when I talk about these ideas to groups of managers, I usually think that the room comprises a third, a third, a third. A third not really interested. You're the next speaker, you're the joke act. Just give me a grid or a framework. Then the MBA types who feel quite cross at what I'm saying because they've paid big money to get an MBA accreditation, which qualifies them to predict and control and be good as a manager. And a third of the people in the room get instinctively and intuitively what I'm saying, and will often come up to me at the end and say, you've simply put into words what I've always thought. And it's that last third group of people who usually end up on the Doctor of Management program or come to the conference or are involved in some kind of activity similar to that in their own workspace. They've just thought about it differently, or maybe haven't had some of the concepts to underpin what it is that they're doing. And I think there's also something else that happens on the Doctor of Management program, that people have a kind of conversion experience, which I have to rein in. They say, well, okay, now I understand the world completely differently. I'm going to go back to my organization and tell them they've been doing it all wrong. And then we need to abandon strategy and we need to abandon our tools and techniques. And I say, steady on, tiger. So this is simply a description of how we think the world is in complexity terms. It doesn't give you immediately any offer of what to do about it. You can only discover that. So what happens if you go back into your workplace thinking differently about what's going on? Inevitably, we say, and that's the very basis for the doctorate that we're offering, your practice will change. So if you take the pragmatic position that thinking, talking, and acting are all phases of activity, then thinking differently will lead you to act differently, which will lead you to talk differently about what you're doing, which will affect other people's actions and their thinking. So gradually, over time, everybody changes their practice in relation to a different understanding of what we think we're doing, even if you weren't to spell it out conceptually. So again, I think it's a myth that you have to think about it first and then act, or come up with a clear slide deck which explains why we're getting it all wrong. Rather than turning up to work thinking differently about what you're doing, therefore acting differently and speaking differently about it, and then engaging other people in that different conversation. And then gradually over time, everybody's thinking and acting differently, and new things are possible. So that's the theory of nonlinear change, where a small thing can amplify over time into a big thing. And the second thing about, I don't want to talk about leaders at all. I think we've talked about leaders far too much. And I don't think it's just the leader's responsibility to create these conversations. Sometimes leadership emerges from people who are not leaders. It's a group activity. And one of the problems of privileging conversation is that in turn gets instrumentalized. So there was a period during the development of the Doctor of Management program, people would go around saying, are we having a real conversation? You know, a meaningful, complex conversation. Let's keep it every day. So it's simply talking to each other about what we think is going on. There's nothing very sophisticated about it at all. The sophisticated part, I think, comes from accepting that we might conflict, accepting that we're a plural group, not knowing what anybody's going to say next, and being able to hang on to your anxiety a bit and not have to close it down by babbling or saying we need an agenda or reaching for a felt tip pen to scroll something on the whiteboard. But actually, it's a very ordinary, normal human activity. It doesn't need a special method. So somehow we've convinced ourselves that we need a process in order to achieve a process. But actually, we just need to relearn to talk to one another.
Was there a part two, Shin, or are you?
Yeah, I just
okay.
I don't know if you should let Lauren have a go first before.
Okay, we'll circle back to you. Okay, Lauren. Lauren's up.
Sure, thank you. So I'm going to pose a question and then share a brief, very, very brief background of why I'm asking what I'm asking. I'm curious, when you've said a few times the idea of engaging with here and now in the present, I'm wondering what your position is around the idea of getting out of our heads and into the bodies. So rejecting this, what I judge to be this over-intellectualization and kind of superiority of the mind in favor of other ways of knowing that often aren't existing, experienced in academic institutions, in corporations. And the reason I'm asking is it's very rare that I've been in a space where there's even a signaling of this consciousness, this understanding. And so it's what you had referenced earlier around weaving in these other practices, these other, disciplines or fields to move differently. So how do you address that in a space that was designed intentionally, historically, to reject these other ways of knowing as invalid, as illogical?
Well, I would say that my mind is in my body. And I don't think of the mind as being relegated to the head. So I think our minds, so George Herbert Mead's definition of a mind is a body's activity towards itself. So I'm working with that theory of mind, and I'm working with the idea that being in organizations provokes very strong feelings in people, which is why we draw on the group analytic tradition to have a way of meeting together and exploring those strong feelings that arise when resonating human beings find themselves trying to find a way to go on together. So I'm not interested in just intellectualizing, but because I run an academic program, intellectualizing has to be part of what we do. Sometimes we do theatre workshops. We've even had people who've come and done art to explore those different ways of knowing. But in the end, and for what I'm running, which is no reason why in organizational settings you shouldn't do other things. But for my group, they are judged on the quality of their thesis that they submit at the end. But there's all kinds of different ways of knowing that's gone into making that thesis, but they are also obliged to theorize from it at the same time. So why I wouldn't want to overemphasize the importance of the intellect, I also wouldn't want to subtract it from ways of knowing as well. And certainly our ways of knowing involve talking about and experiencing intense feelings towards each other. Did you have other forms of knowing and activity in mind?
Yes, and I appreciate kind of what you're referencing around the mind-body connectivity. I think what I'm referencing, I'm in a space where a lot of the direction I'm shifting towards is informed by, like, so for instance, you know, acceptances of what is around complexity, or how I'm perceiving that is informed by areas that would probably invite a lot of skepticism. So for instance, when looking at how other spaces are trying to investigate and explain and unravel complexity, if it's around non-human intelligence or anomalous phenomena, when you study the way that they study, it's quite interesting in how, and perhaps that's what you've been referencing, we don't often integrate you know, those disciplines. But you know, when I think about, frankly, you know, the esoteric and mystic tradition has influenced how I show up and understand what you were referencing, this mind-body connectivity. But more, even if I think about, we get into a room together and we jump to talk and debate. And I think there's to what you suggested, a place for that. And also when we sit with this idea of collective effervescence, the energy of a group that is automatically at some juncture can provide a level of synchronicity that our minds often don't connect to us. So if we, you know, look at kind of the energetics of being together, not even if it's kind of these unspoken dynamics, to me, this feels very much on the fringe of what is acceptable in most, you know, in most conventional organizational settings. But I'm just, you know, maybe appealing to the group of, this is something that I'm very much in tune with, sitting with, and finding a way to integrate and make this a valid exploration that maybe doesn't belong, like in conventional sense, doesn't belong from most people's point of view.
Yeah, I don't know whether you come across Jean Bolton's book, but I think that's one of the things that she aspires to doing, is to reintegrating the mystical into the material. And I would say I'm also interested in it, but it's not part of my professional work.
Thank
you. Okay. Tiani, Shana, I'll come back to you in just 1 minute. Tiani, you had excavated 2 good questions from the chat, you said. Do you want to tell me what those are right now?
Oh, you covered them. Yeah, you got
we
them.
did. We got them already? Okay, great. Part two, Shin.
Thanks. Yeah, so I would like to hear Chris' view on this distinction between dependency or yeah, so dependency and interdependencies. So in I work a lot with software, and I think in technology you mentioned as well, in these advanced technology realms, one architecture principle we often talk about is reduce dependencies, like putting software into these boxes and then reduce the lines between them so we can have autonomy inside our little bubbles. And obviously, some people have been also, some leaders and managers have also been doing that in the human space, doing the organizational design, following the similar pattern even in some of the agile, with the big agile processes and so forth. But then I was just thinking the celebration of the interconnectedness, the interdependencies in the human society or in the human organization seems to be rather underappreciated. It's just like dependencies are bad, coordination is bad, and we should just get rid of them. And it's been pushing to an extreme. So I was just wondering, this seemingly paradox between dependency and interdependency, which seems to me lies in between the what Dave Snowden calls complicated system and complex system. And it seems that we are overcomplicating and complexifying in a way. But
Yeah.
I just want to hear your view on this.
Okay, so the idea of our being independent, rational animals is an idea which has grown in status in the West, at least since the Enlightenment. And I think in the last 30 or 40 years, it has been turbocharged in the political philosophy of neoliberalism, where we're encouraged to think of ourselves as individuals separate from one another in competition with each other. Famously summed up by one of our political leaders in the UK, Mrs. Thatcher, who said, "There is no such thing as society. There are only individuals and their families." So Aristotle said that the easiest way to effect a tyranny is to separate people from one another, to stop them coming together. So you could understand neoliberalism as a form of tyranny because it encourages us to think that way. Of course, if you were a neoliberal, you would say, well, this is the highest form of freedom, is a kind of Kantian freedom, which understands the fullest expression of freedom of our standing independently. And in the group psychodynamic tradition, there are two very clear, distinct traditions of group analytic psychotherapy, for example. There's the Tavistock tradition, very much Kantian inspired. The groups are potentially harmful places where people are provoked into anxiety. And the best way of realizing your individuality is to realize that you are independent of the group. And there's a group analytic tradition that my research tradition follows, which argues completely the opposite. The best way to understand your individuality is to realize how interdependent you are with others. Same phenomenon, different conclusion. And one further example, I think, speaking as a Brit, was the Brexit debate. So those in favor of Brexit were arguing Britain can stand alone. We can be a sovereign nation standing on our own. We don't need to be dependent on Europe. The opposite argument, pro-Europe argument, was we are always and forever interdependent, and you'll either be interdependent with Europe or you'll be interdependent with the United States and China. So who do you want to be interdependent with? And actually that interdependence with Europe is a way of gaining greater freedom, not less. So that discussion of what we mean by independent and what we mean by interdependent plays out in all kinds of political and social and economic ways at the moment. But the prevailing and dominant orthodoxy is individualism, competitive individualism. So it's interesting that it shows up in software design as well. So I think it's probably clear which side of the fence I stand on. I stand on the interdependent side, that I think the idea of us being independent and cut off from one another is a complete myth.
Yeah, so I think I stand on the same side of the fence.
Yeah.
But I think my personal journey has been around about I was born in communist China. So I was raised as a child despising communities or interdependencies because so it was like embracing the Western values and individualism and independence and so forth. And you know, now I'm in my midlife. I just it's kind of like a round trip, and I find myself advocating like interdependence and community and belonging and these things I used to work against as a child. So I find life very interesting sometimes.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing your perspective.
Great. I just to circle back for 1 minute, Chris, I you know, in that conversation with Chris Quinn about the, you know, the fact that people aren't always open to this, I do think it's important to acknowledge how exhausted everyone is all the time. You know, there's so much, you know, cognitive overload inside many organizations. I mean, someone actually asked me a question about complexity, and I tried to point them towards 2 books, and they said, please don't give me anything to read. Can you recommend some videos? And I was like, well, okay, you know, I can try, but it is, you know, I think that, and I'd like to loop in Chris Rogers on this if he's still here, because you said something interesting in the chat about how we are all walking case studies. And I think that there's one of the difficulties is feeling how complex your environment is, but we often presuppose that we're able to observe it from the outside. Is that well, I mean, yeah, I mean, is that your experience of this, that many people assume that they will be able to observe complexity?
Yeah. If you're directing that at me, Barbara, yeah, I think the fact is, the reason I say that is that this is the life that we're all living. And if you take Chris's opening comments around complex responsive processes, my perspective is that is everything is the complex responsive process of our everyday human interaction. Everything that happens, so all the bad stuff as well as all the good stuff, is an emergent property of that. And then the question comes, well, given that, if we believe that's how the world works, then what do we do about it? And Chris's, you know, second part, if you like, was given these complex conditions, then how might we behave differently to get something positive, rather than what we might consider to be positive rather than negative out of it. So that, you know, that's where I'm coming from on this. Complex responsive process is a description of what's happening all the time in all contexts. The question is, given that, how might we then interact with that, if you like? How might we deal with our everyday lives, given that that is a description that Chris is put forward and that I would agree with as a description of what's actually going on in all contexts. So given that, how can we best respond to that? And my point about being walking case studies of it is, we actually, if deep down, my view is, we actually all know it's like this. But politically, power relations, and all the other dynamics that are part and parcel of complex responsive process view of the world, if you like, fight against our acceptance of that. The power relations and political dynamics, for example, serve the interests of large populations, or relatively small, I suppose, in a global sense, populations, and so they sustain a lot of the negativity that flows that we're living in, if you like, and some of the things that Chris has alluded to. So that's my point about walking case studies. Deep down, we all know that it's unknowable, but we're told within an organizational context, on the news every day, the same patterns emerged that, you know, we should know about it. We've got a government at the moment, and this is not a political with a big P point. I'm not arguing against, you know, a particular political stance, but the government's made promises in order to get elected, and when it gets there, it finds it can't actually enact a lot of these things because the real world's not like that. It's not predictable, and so on and so forth. But yet we're sucked into this, and everybody expects them. We've got CEOs paid millions a year who say we need certainty. You know, this is ludicrous, but that's the world, and what I'm saying is that in itself, that sort of discourse is itself an emergent property of the complex responsive processes of everyday human interaction. That's how we've got here. Chris is talking about, given that process, how might we interact differently, potentially to shift that pattern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Chris Mowles, there was a question in the chat about complex responsive process of relating, which is that, is this something that is ever finished and now just being applied to practice, or are there scholars further developing it as a theoretical framework?
On the idea of applying it, and I'm not policing language, but we don't apply it. I suppose it's a way of seeing the world, just as Chris Rogers has just described. And yes, students are still developing their thesis, and they bring in other authors that I've not come across before, so that gets added to the canon. And if you like, more and more social activity can be understood from the perspective of perspectives we call complex responsive processes. And I think, speaking to your earlier point, Barbara, about sort of overwhelm, there's a fantastic paper written by Alverson and Spicer called Functional Stupidity. So stupidity in organizations also has a function, because we can't doubt everything all of the time. We can't treat everything as complex. In fact, we make our way through the world mostly unreflectively. And we only think about the complexity of the situations we're in when we bump up against something that confounds us or perplexes us in some ways. But there's a huge emphasis on smart organizations and knowledge-based organizations. But I think we need to speak up for stupidity as well. I mean, stupidity has a fantastic role in organizations of allowing us to survive, probably, about not having to think about everything all of the time. And the original pragmatic scholar Charles Sanders Peirce said the same thing. We can't doubt everything all of the time. We just have to doubt those things where it's not working out for us, where we need to do something different. And there are enough of those, aren't there?
True. All right, well, we're at the top of the hour. I don't see any more hands up, so this is the last call, folks. Going once, going twice. Okay. Chris, any final thoughts?
Well, it's been a real pleasure. We've covered a lot of ground, perhaps too much. A lot to absorb, and I've really enjoyed the questions. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, thank you. We are so grateful that you've decided to share this time with us, and please know that you are always welcome back. And we're very sad to hear that your program will be winding down. And so you and your colleagues can consider this your second home if you'd like to come and talk
Okay.
about complexity. You're always welcome.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Yeah, good.
Great. And thanks to all of you for joining us. We're always delighted when we have an engaged audience like this, and I hope you'll come back again soon. We have lots of interesting talks coming up in the fall and through next year. So once again, thanks everyone. Bye.